Hey, Andrew, how are you? Nice to see you on our podcast and really excited to talk to you more about many of the things we're working on lately. To begin, can you please give us an introduction about yourself and then we'll jump in?
Hi, Ram. Thanks for having me. I'm Andrew Pucker for everyone. I'm currently the Vice President of Clinical Event Development at Mintra Health. Really, my job is to be a research coach. So we bring clients in, we help them develop their protocols, and then as we go along, we try to make their study as efficient as possible. And that's kind of how I've come to work with Tilda.
Great. And I'll also add that Mintra is a really great set of individuals, very tech forward, I would say, from a CRO perspective. Maybe to begin with, one of my first questions will be what makes you and your team so, I would say, forward thinking on your adoption cycle and why is it important?
So I think the people at Mintra really thrive because we've all been in the field for a long time. So, for example, I am an optometrist. I have a PhD in myopia development, and I've been doing clinical research for roughly 15 years. And that is kind of the standard at Mintra. So, we've seen a lot and we know what we can do to make things better. So, whenever we get into a protocol, we try to brainstorm the best way to make things efficient, effective, error free. And with that, technology is often the answer. So that's the way I approach it. And I think everyone at Mintra approaches a study.
Got it. All right. And in terms of what we've been working on lately, I would like to cover a few things around that topic, specifically how you're approaching endpoint development and some of the tooling related to collecting these endpoints. So maybe from an audience perspective, could you tell us a little bit about what your motivations are in that aspect and some of the work which we've been working on?
Sure. One thing I've been interested in for at least a decade now is developing endpoints. In particular, things like corneal fluorescein staining, which is a measure of corneal irritation that's often an endpoint in dry eye studies, or tear breakup time. That's another endpoint in dry eye studies that essentially is determining how stable a person's tears are. If they're less stable, they're going to break up quicker, and then they're going to be more likely to have dry eye. The issue with these tests are they're really variable from the doctor's perspective. Typically, as the doctor, you look at the patient's eye and you're asked to make a judgment. Is this for example, a grade 1, 2, or 3 for staining, or is it a breakup of 5 seconds or 6 seconds for the tear breakup time? And with that, you need to bring in some standardization. So every doctor is going to be a little different, right? So we want to train our doctors to do it exactly the same. It's not so big a deal in clinical practice when it's just your everyday patient, but when you're doing, say, a 30-site study, every doctor is doing a little different in their regular practice. We need to train them to do it the study way. And with that, they hopefully bring down the variability. If you can lower your variability, you're going to be more likely to get a significant difference between your groups and more likely to win on your endpoints in the end and get your product approved. So everything we can do in that area to make it more consistent, make it easier for the doctor, less likely to make transposition errors, those sort of things, I think can go a long way. And with Tilda, we've really run with that. So what we've done as a partnership between Mintra and Tilda is build these training programs around those specific outcomes. And we're doing others, but I'm just using that as an example. But what we're doing is we're doing a training within TildaSense. And what that is going to have the doctor do before they get into the study, or the study coordinator before they get into their study, is to take an online training. This training will effectively walk them through the whole procedure step by step, and then it'll do a knowledge check. And if they don't do it quite right, then we can see that because everything is transparent in the TildaSense system. So we can see, did they get these questions right or wrong? Are they proficient? If they're not proficient, we can go and do a tune-up training with them. But once they successfully complete that, then they can go and do their trial. They can see the subjects and still we can have a pulse on how they're doing. Specifically, we've built in like a real-time measure of how they're doing the tests. So with one of the tests, the tear breakup time as an example, they need to do tests at very specific times. So they apply corneal fluorescein stain. This is something that just mixes in with the tears. We start a timer, and then they're not allowed to start grading until 1 minute. So the machine will say, hey, it's been a minute, you can start grading. And then they have up to 5 minutes total to complete this test. So it'll say, hey, you're within the window or not. And it can, in real time, track the amount of time for your breakup time by just having the doctor or their assistant potentially turn the stopwatch on and off, and it's collecting the data within the system. So typically, as a doctor, you may be at the slit lamp with your cell phone using that as a timer, and you can see how that might lead to errors, right? They may have transposition errors, etc., by putting that number into the system, but the system is collecting the data directly in this instance so that there's less likely for all those transposition errors, and then just less likely for them to get it wrong. So those are just some examples. I think you could do this with a whole bunch of different outcomes. And kind of the cool thing with working with Tilda is it's very efficient, cost effective. Like some of these products could be probably hundreds of thousands of dollars if you go to other vendors, but this is just part of their normal offering. So I love that too.
So, what we've kind of described, or at least the way I look at it, is it's a very guided way of walking through sites in the process of endpoint collection. And I also noticed that in the past, you've looked at other systems where they're disjointed, right? You have training, which is separated out from the actual collection. And you have two different ways of sort of training and collecting, and that can lead to some inconsistency as well. But since the way we've developed this specific set of endpoint modules, it's basically, this is how you collect it, and you use the same exact module to train as well. And then the trainer is essentially assessing you based on how you're using the module in terms of how accurate you are in the process. What I'd like to know is, what was your past experience like in similar use cases? What is being done currently in the industry, and what are the type of challenges you faced in the past where this sort of an integrated system or workflow does not exist?
I think the most common way to do this sort of training, so I'll use corneal fluorescein staining as an example, is that you'll have this investigator meeting before a study starts. So all the investigators, if you can get them to attend, hopefully they're not on vacation. Hopefully they all attend. Often they don't. They will have to sit through this, say, 4-hour session, which is important, but it can get long. And as we know, our attention can wander within that 4 hours. So you will get at some point in that meeting where the expert goes over that specific method. It could be staining, like I said, or something totally different, but you just give them a PowerPoint lecture like you would in any, say, academic classroom, and then you hope that they do it right. And maybe there's some sort of multiple choice test or something afterwards, but that's kind of more your typical academic kind of lecture learning situation. Whereas with the TildaSense system, you have them in the system. It's the same system that you're using for everything else for the study. And you can know if they're actually doing it because, like, you can watch the amount of time they're taking it. You can see if they got the questions right or wrong, all in real time. So I think it's just making it more modernized, and it's better feedback for the sponsors. Like, you can really know if these people are paying attention or not. Whereas it's pretty hard to know if you're on a video call, if they're like walking their dog. Who knows what they could be doing.
Yeah. So that's essentially talking about the training process. But what about when the assessment is actually happening, when you have a subject in front of you, when a patient is in front of you, right? What have you seen in the past? And I'd like to specifically understand some of the challenges which might have been presented, and what are the implications of having that type of an inconsistency in the past. So yeah, anything you can add more light on that. I guess in the past, given the lack of an integrated system or guided workflows, what we have done is essentially trained and then given worksheets and essentially expect the site staff to do this on a consistent basis. And also the study has 30 different sites and maybe 60 different people who are probably doing the assessments, to each at a site possibly. And you're dealing with this sort of a variability and you're hoping that everybody's following the protocol. But I'm curious, is it basically people just writing down at a certain time, this is what I've done, and another time, this is what I've done, and you're just making sure that those times all add up when you monitor? Is that how it's done? Or how was this done before we existed and before you existed in terms of developing this kind of a capability?
Yeah, I think that historically, what everyone has done is they're essentially their typical clinical workflow. They're seeing a patient and they're probably writing down the data on paper. So, with that, there's very little visibility from the CRO or the sponsor side on how they're really doing this. Like, we can kind of look at their data to make sure it makes sense on the back end with paper. They put it on paper, they put it then in their data capture system, and then we can see if it makes sense. But there's really no gatekeeper or checker on, are they doing the times right? So with the TildaSense system, we can know, did they turn the timer on? Yes. And then did they hopefully start their grading at a specific time? And then did they have all their data in the system before that timer went off? So with that, I think the quality has much better tracking. We know what they're doing and ideally when they're doing it.
Right. So it's essentially like a real-time monitoring process here, in other words, right? And that also leads to better consistency because it's real time. You get a direct alert immediately if something was not correct or validly measured, and that leads to better quality. That's essentially how you're thinking about it. Have you seen studies where this has become a problem? Is this something which you do see or have seen in the field where eventually it had an adverse event or an adverse effect on the trial itself?
I think from a workload perspective, I see issues commonly. So it's not uncommon for some sites, I don't want to say all sites, but some sites might have hundreds of protocol deviations that need to be mitigated before you do your database lock, that sort of thing. So it leads to a lot of stress on the whole study team trying to resolve these like transposition errors or those sort of things. I think that poor training in general is a top reason why sponsors don't get the data they think they're going to get. So if there's a lot of variability in your measure, that's much more likely to result in a failure of achieving your endpoints. So having this additional rigor, I think, is going to make it more likely that everyone succeeds too.
Right. And in terms of having access to this kind of a data, like high frequency, high amount of fidelity data, how does that help either a sponsor or a CRO in terms of day-to-day trial execution or even overall as a program success, right? Are there ways where you can think of this helping them and what it can do?
I think if you start with this sort of thing from the beginning of your program development, so your first in human study, you can use the data collected along the way to optimize future studies. So we might learn that it's hard for the doctors to get a specific test done in a given amount of time. So with that information, we can take that to our our phase 2 or phase 3 study and better design our protocols so that they are efficient, effective, and error free. So I think that is really interesting from just a protocol development standpoint and probably success factor.
And that's something which is a unique advantage in this model because otherwise you're not going to get this kind of information unless you really process every single, every single data point collected on a paper for timing and doing a whole bunch of analytical work on top of it before you get to this information, right? And in this sort of a case, you have much higher frequency. You're probably seeing data which would otherwise be hard to see. And that leads to a better protocol design as you work through the next phases of the trial. Is that fair?
Yeah, and it's kind of standard to not have to enter your data into an EDC for a day or two or three. This is instant enter into your EDC. So it's just faster and you have way more visibility in what's actually happening.
That's right. So that's an important aspect of what we should cover, because what I've also seen is sponsors and CROs typically give sites essentially an EDC setup, which is where the data capture happens, and there's probably 5 to 10 other systems which they're also giving them, right? So there's training systems, there's ePros, there's IRTs, EDC, and training might not talk to each other. IRT might talk to EDC, hopefully. So there's these like siloed approaches of like building technology and bringing it into a study. And our approach has been the integration or the lack of is what's causing quite a bit of burden on the site at the moment, and leads to several inefficiencies in even the trial being a success, both from time, cost, or better design work or better insights into the next study. So one of the principles which we've taken at Tilda is just producing one platform which can integrate all the way from a CTMS, EDC, TMF, source, ePro, your trainings, your IRT. So it's really like an end-to-end platform which has the capability to manage a trial in entirety. And on top of that, building automation or AI capabilities which are deeply integrated across the stack. So this provided the type of capabilities, I think, when we first started talking about how do we build certain endpoints into guided workflows on our platform? How can we build it so that the site is directly entering the data, but then part of it can flow directly into your EDC? And I think having that kind of a architectural advantage in our platform really helped us figure out how we can start to build these kind of endpoints and generally start to design much better trials for the various indications where these sort of endpoints are being used, right? But particularly, one thing I wanted to touch on is this particular assessment. Like, I know if you're talking about the fluorescein staining and tear breakup time, that's a very time-based assessment. It's almost like you have to do certain assessments within a certain specified amount of time, and if you don't, you can really meaningfully change the outcome of the endpoint in this particular study. Andrew, in addition to the tear breakup time as an endpoint, what are some of the other endpoints you're looking at to build directly into a platform like ours, and why?
Sure. One endpoint that's pretty much on every study is visual acuity. And I really never realized how important visual acuity was until I came to the CRO world. It was kind of like a throwaway back at the university, like, oh, let's get their vision, right? But on a clinical trial, you either are using visual acuity as a safety outcome or you're using it as a safety and efficacy outcome. And with that, pretty much every study uses what we call the ETDRS, Early Treatment in Diabetic Retinopathy Study charts. So they're the very specific logmar charts, meaning that they have even spacing between the different lines on the visual acuity chart, which the patient needs to read. So with that, it's a really intense sort of protocol, and with the TildaSense system, it actually walks you through it. So you have the patient reading the chart, and then the coordinator can follow along right in the TildaSense system, checking off if they got the letters correct or not. So it just kind of guides them through it step by step. And then in the end, it actually does the math for you, because the math is not straightforward, actually. So it bases the math on the number of letters that you correctly read, and then it just tells you the logmar score after that. So that's on pretty much every test, or I should say every trial. In addition to that, there's some variations. So you may have a different chart that you need to use for children. And with that, you can just kind of overlay that chart on the standard chart. So it's just an easy copy and paste so that you can build that into your system and run your study with that chart. Another thing is there's this Berkeley rudimentary test for vision. It's a standardized low vision test. So if you don't do very well on the standard ETDRS chart, so you get 0 letters correct, then you need to go to do low vision testing. So these people are fairly impaired. They may have a retinal disease, etc. And the system will guide you through it. So you won't really have to think too much about it. You'll do your standard test, you'll get your score of 0, and it'll tell you right away, hey, you also need to do this Berkeley test, and this is how you do it. So with that, you're more likely to do it properly, and then you're also less likely to forget about the other tests that you need to do, because it's just telling you how to do that in order. And then, of course, after that, you move on to your next test in the TildaSense system, and it just tells you, hey, this is what's next, which is really, really important in the clinical trial, because one test can have an impact on the next test. So if you do things out of order, that's also really bad, and it could increase your variability. It's, of course, a protocol deviation, but the system is built to avoid that.
That makes sense. Is sort of an analogy like, you know, you're looking at data capture as more of a very rich interface, which helps you guide collection. So in other words, instead of a basic form, you're sort of saying, okay, why don't we build a rich application interface? And it's kind of like building an iPhone app, right? So it's much more simpler to use. It's doing a whole bunch of checking and guiding for you, and so the variability really is reduced. You probably have higher consistency on the endpoint by designing these type of interfaces for different assessments.
For sure. I kind of imagine how it used to take like a whole day to set up a computer, and now like your MacBook just does it itself. So like moving, from like paper to the TildaSense system is kind of like that. Like it's just kind of telling you what to do, and you don't need to think all that hard about it, and you probably don't need to be all that tech savvy to do it, even though it's really rich in technology.
Yeah. And I think that's, thanks for pointing that out, because one of the things which we really cared about building Tilda is design. I think the ability to bring technology, which is complicated and often hard to use in many situations, right? I think bringing that bar down can really only be done through beautiful interface and design. And we've really spent a lot of effort in focusing on that and making sure product is very easy to use. There's really good user experience and interfaces built into it. And obviously, like learning from our partnership, I think a lot of this sort of assessments can definitely use better interfaces. I think you can significantly reduce the variability which we see otherwise on this. And I can very clearly see how this can also help sponsors, right? And the trial itself. So that's been great.
Yeah, if you have something that's user friendly, you're more likely to get the great sites. There's a lot of sites out there, and most of them can produce, but not that many of them can hit it out of the park. So if you can entice those really attractive sites onto your study because you have this super easy to use platform, I think that's a win too.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, cool. I think that's good. And that was very fascinating to me. And the ranges are not very wide. These we're talking about minutes to seconds sometimes. And I found it really interesting that we essentially, as an industry, did not have a really strong, set of like governance or real-time validation capabilities around how you're collecting this data. And a lot of it is just dependent on whatever you write down on a paper, and you go with whatever is said there, right? And I think there's something to be said in terms of like the overall industry, where this sort of a platform can add a lot of value in terms of just designing better study protocols, better execution of these protocols, and maybe ultimately finding the right place for the right for the drugs we're developing, right? So really like trying to get them to be optimal in terms of coming into the market. So anything else you want to like kind of add? I mean, I'm curious about how you see the next several years to come from Mintra's perspective, because what I've noticed is you're very active in developing and creating these sort of endpoints and really standing out in terms of executing trials in a way which I've not seen many others sort of do. But I am curious, like, what do you think is the impact of these sort of endpoints and integrated platforms in how you see Mintra and the future of trial operations in, I think, ophthalmology in this case, but maybe other therapeutic areas as well?
Sure. A couple comments about what you said first, though. With like tier breakup time, we've been doing it exactly the same since probably the late 70s. So it's nice to bring some new technology, innovation, rigor to that. So I love that we're doing that. I also love that everything is integrated. I hate having 11 passwords and then they all change at different times and then I don't know what passwords what. So from the site and CRO standpoint, I think it's great that you can just sign into one platform and do everything. And for our sponsors, it's probably just logistically easier. You don't need to get quotes from like 5 different vendors. It's just one vendor that does everything. So I think it makes it simpler and cheaper because everything's integrated. You get rid of some redundancies. I think going forward, I think we can keep optimizing, with our partnership, of course, these sort of systems. So with the electronic data capture system, I think we can make it even smarter. So one thing that we haven't done yet, but I'd like to do hopefully in the near future is that if you have a really rigorous set of inclusion criteria for picking, for example, your study eye or if you qualify or not, you could have the system just automatically tell you on the spot as the doctor, like you put in your values and maybe they're captured in real time because you were doing the timer and all the right things. And then you get to this page that it takes all the data together for you and says this patient qualifies or not. So I think that could be really, really interesting. I think that overall, I think we can keep optimizing it so that things are just cheaper and faster and easier. And, we're never going to have a study get done in a day, but maybe we can maximize the system so much that it's allowable for the sites to see twice as many patients than they would have already. So I think that's another potential thing that I think you're already kind of doing on the Tilda side. I think you're making sites more efficient, but I think we can keep running with that.
Mhm.
From a training standpoint, it'd be nice to have some sort of training for every outcome that's important. I think that your platform allows for that. You got a big team of engineers who, if you give them an idea, they run with it and they come back with a product in a week or two, which is just amazing. So I think, we started with some of these dry eye things, but we can expand this to anything that we want. And then, as a field, we can grow and use this together.
What's your thoughts on, from a sponsor perspective, the prior experience you had versus some of the recent experience you're seeing with these type of technologies, right? How has that changed? Just the relationship between you as a CRO and the sponsor and the value the sponsors are gaining.
I think it's been really hard to just kind of integrate everything. There's just so many vendors that you need to have on a successful study. So, it could be 5 or more vendors, and if you can eliminate that down to 2 instead of 5, I think that is a huge win right there. Um, I'm sure there's other things that are going to come down the road, but like that alone, I think is a huge win.
Yeah, and that's coming back to this idea of how do you build better integrated systems which are easier to config, modify, deploy, and I think to a certain extent the fact that there's so much automation capability we've baked into our platform, and I think nowadays it would be very unusual for you to say, hey, how come this product does not have some kind of a AI or automation based way to like create a workflow or set up a platform or some kind of an integration or even answer certain questions, right? So I think that's sort of a trend I do believe is going to be happening across the board, not just with us, but other technology platforms which are looking into modernizing this sort of workflow. So another aspect of what you touched on, which I think is really interesting, is I noticed from a CRO or a sponsor perspective, study startup is an interesting time frame. There's a lot of work which is done in order to bring up the study and bring up each site, and really get it ready for like a first patient, first visit to happen from the time you've executed your CTA, let's say, right? And I also noticed that there's quite a bit of time spent on this exact problem of getting systems ready or getting everything ready, with the fact that you're constantly also seeing some kind of changes in terms of your requirements. So can you maybe talk a little bit more about that part of it, where we've gone through some iterations where you say, well, this is what we want, and the system should be able to configure quickly. And if we didn't have the right tooling and the right ways to do it, I mean, in our case, it's largely AI-driven, an agent-driven approach. But I'm just curious, like, have you seen situations where that the impact is pretty visible? Maybe it's longer timelines or things like that. Right? And would like to understand how you've seen that happen in the past.
Yeah, I do think that if you don't get on board with AI, you're going to be left in the past. So that I think that's clear. And I think, yeah, with any study, the kind of go live first subject lead up is very, very stressful. And a lot of that comes from one, you have to prepare roughly 10 different major documents. And if you could have an AI system where you feed in the protocol and then it shoots information to all of these 10 different documents and gets it 80% of the way there, that would just save weeks of time, I think. So that's something I think that AI could help us with. Like, I think there's going to have to be a human touch on it, at least for many more years. But I think AI can get it really close, and that will just save valuable hours for the really skilled people, which honestly are in low supply. There's some really smart people out there, but the CR world is very, very specialized, and there's not enough people to do that work. So if we can make their jobs easier so that maybe they can do two projects and not feel stressed out instead of doing one project and feeling stressed out, I think that could be a game changer. And then there's a lot of documents to manage. Like, I don't even think I know all the documents that are on a study, because we have really skilled clinical leads and project managers that are helping me. I'm more on the medical side of things, but they have to file hundreds of documents, and if you can automate that, that also will make everyone less stressed. You're less likely to lose them, and overall you'll be in better regulatory compliance. So like, that's all happening at the same time. It could be within like a month window, especially
Yeah.
if you have a sponsor who wants to make a public announcement that they're going to see their first subject before Arvo or like another important meeting. So like, we're often given these timelines that are maybe a little unreasonable, but we go above and beyond to meet them. But if you have AI helping you, I think that is going to make things even easier going forward.
Yeah, and I think case in point, that's exactly what our regulatory teammates do, right? It's helping you prepare documentation, get them signed off, doing document QC on top of them, and essentially driving the process forward at scale. So you're not bottlenecked from a people time perspective, but you're still very much involved in the process and the oversight side of things. But what I've also noticed, or at least would like to touch point, is do you see something similar on setting up the various systems and change management at the vendor level? And how often do you see that happen before the study starts, where requirements are changing, so you would have to go back and forth with different vendors, and sort of it takes certain time to sort of propagate all this requirements into all the systems or all the vendors you're working with, right? How big of a pain point is that? And have you seen issues arise of that sort?
Pretty much every study I've ever been on has had a last minute change. Maybe we notice that the vendor is doing XYZ. Maybe it's something related to a reading center as an example, and they feel like they need to optimize the protocol a little bit last minute, because they may not get the protocol until you're further along, right? You kind of are building the study. And then that actually could spring a change in several other documents. So you might have to change the protocol and then like a manual of procedures and then maybe a pharmacy manual. Like having one change could really throw a wrench in things. So you have to quality control check all these other documents. And if you had a system that could do most of that for you, that would be amazing.
Yeah, yeah. And what about data management sort of things? Do you generally see changes which then propagate into your EDC pros and edit checks and things like that as well?
A lot of protocol changes will then translate into needing to update your source documents and your EDC. So that can cause, like a post production change in your EDC, which again is just another downstream effect of changing the protocol, which it takes a lot of time. Like it could take days for the team to put in the change and then have other people double check it and get sponsors sign off. So if you can automate that as well, I think it's really going to be a game changer.
Right, right. Yeah, and I think that's kind of the fascinating thing. I've certainly seen timelines be thrown around, which from the looks of it seems very aggressive. But when I start to go into the nitty gritty detail, I think what's said is very different from what's actually being done, and that gap is wide. I feel, and not enough. Even from a sponsor's perspective, I feel it's not appreciated, right? Like I think you sort of frequently hear what you'd like to hear from service providers and vendors, but in reality, how do I actually get there is a very different question, and it's a complicated problem to solve without modern technologies and automation and AI and so on and so forth, right? But I think in some ways having an integrated platform and having really strong automation built into it, I think are good ways to go about solving for this type of a issue. So
I think the timelines are important, and it'd be nice to sometimes delay things, but you often can't because maybe the sponsor's timeline is tied to funding. Like if they don't meet this mark, maybe they're not going to get the money to do the next thing. So yeah, doing everything we can to make the timelines work is important, and every tool we can get to make that more likely to happen, I think, is valuable.
another curious question I have is, we've spoken about a lot of very interesting and fascinating aspects of trial execution, which clearly like Mintra is pioneering, and we're happy to be part of that journey. I'm curious, how do sponsors receive it? I'm sure you spend quite a bit of time with founders and sponsors who are looking to work with you, but I'm just curious, like what is the reaction and when you go about talking about all these capabilities you're bringing through Mintra?
Sure. So one of my jobs as VP of clinical development is to help with sales. So that's one of my big jobs. I do go and meet with CEOs of companies, leads of clinical development, etc. And what we do at Mintra is we try to use our partnership with Tilda as a differentiator. And I often bring up AI, efficiency, cost savings, and it really piques people's interest. We know that AI is a buzzword now, but we kind of bring that to their world. We say we're a CRO who partners with this company called Tilda, who has this amazing AI technology that can help make things faster, more efficient. And that kind of just opens the door and we do a discussion and then maybe we do a little demo. And I think it's been really well received. I think that people are still a little skeptical, to be honest, but they want to learn more. And once you show them what we're doing, they get even more excited. So I think as our partnership grows and as AI becomes more accepted, it's just going to be even a bigger thing going forward.
Yeah, and I will say we are seeing something very similar from other partners and sponsors we work with. I think the understanding of what exactly is AI and how it can be helpful and used, I feel is not it's not ubiquitous, right? Everyone's got slightly different versions of what that means, and I think being able to show a platform which is actually working, and here's what happens with your protocol. You put it in, the system starts to come alive, and there are teammates going and doing certain work, or AI teammates I should call, doing certain parts of the workflow. You've got a single system which is fully integrated end to end. And I think that's where the aha moment really starts to come in. It's like, wow, like, okay, this is actually real. This is actually something I can use. And I think, you kind of have to wrap your head around this new mode of implementation of your clinical development program, probably. But I think from what I've seen with Mintra and the work you guys are doing, I think you're really thinking about it from first principles perspective, saying, we are building the modern AI-driven or technology-driven CRO. How would we do it without sort of falling into the classic, because we've done it a certain way for the last X number of years, we will continue to do it this way, right? So, which is interesting. And I'm also pretty fascinated that you've gotten a pretty good amount of success already in terms of working with several sponsors and trials. I wish you all the best, and it's been amazing working with you guys. Thanks, Andrew, and thanks for your time on this podcast.
Yeah, this is great. I'm a scientist first, so I wouldn't try to push anything I didn't believe in. So I think this works, and I really do partner or value our partnership, and I look forward to doing more.
Thank you.